Hello, everyone. Damon with MBTV. We got Jack again with Socionics, Socionics perspective. We got Blake, Daniel, Trey, and so we're going to be talking about Socionics Quadras today. So as far as understanding what the relevance of the Quadras is, the practical application of Quadras, and then a brief but yet informed perspective of what the Quadras are and how to define them. I think this is an effective way to help identify your Socionics type as well. As we discussed on the last live show, there are distinct variations between the translation of MBTI and Socionics. They're two different theories based around the Jungian cognitive functions. So we really want to go into what quadras are there, and there's still 16 types in Socionics. They're divided by 4, so 4 types in each quadra, and we got 4 quadras. Kind of the funny since the name is quadras in the first place. All right, so that being said, Jack, I don't know. I'm going to start off with the question of what is the relevance of quadras and why is it important?
Well, I'd say that the relevance of quadras comes from the idea of there being certain value systems that separate the different types. One of the things which I think that, say, MBTI often did was sort of conflate the idea of valuing something with being strong at it. The point where you had, like, say, your dominant and auxiliary functions being the things which you most enjoyed doing, but then your mobilizing of your inferior function means some sort of opposition to what you'd normally do. In Socionics, it presents the idea that instead those 4 functions are sort of like egosyntonic, I think a word which was often used by somewhat MBTI people. This idea that you value these things, that they all come together for forming your worldview, and that the other 4, the ones that don't really appear in sort of the function stack in MBTI, those are the ones which are against your value systems, the ones which are sort of like counterintuitive to how you like to perceive the world. And this sort of idea lays the way towards duality, the idea that you find someone who is opposite to you in your strengths, but actually shares your value systems. Yin-yang field of Socionics duality, but you have 2 halves coming together to actually complete a sort of process, making things synergize. I think that if you look into values and understanding how different people view the world differently, that can explain a lot in terms of how people clash, how people don't really understand each other, and also how, say, the advice of one person being given to you, you may not actually relate to. Why? Because your value systems are probably rather different. I think it has lots of applications, say, to counseling, to education, to all sorts of areas. In Socionics, quadras are placed front and center. So I'd say that to get a good understanding of the type, you need to first understand the quadra and where the type fits within that quadra. In a way, I'd say that's probably the first thing someone should be learning about Socionics.
Okay, so quadras obviously is kind of would you say it's fair to say that the quadras are like the backbone of Socionics, kind of where everything kind of stems from?
I'd say it's like, and I'd say the backbone is probably Model A. I say that quadra is like the most important front end aspect of Socionics we need to understand before you can sort of understand how the types fit together.
Okay.
Model A, but I think the quadras are the important face.
All right, so guys, the quadras in Socionics is based on your alpha, your beta, your gamma, and your delta quadras. And the quadras are based on the perception functions, and they're based on the judging aspect of each person who's paired with a perception function. So if we look at a particular quadra, what you're going to find is NISE plus more of a pragmatic edge, and then you're going to find NISE plus more of a what would you say, relational edge. Is that the how you would do that? What is the
Oh, right. I say that, for instance, NISE, I say that that's basically the 2 perceiving functions coming together, and the 2 other perceiving functions, say NESI, coming together to form a certain sort of value system, and they sort of conflict. So world accepting, I'd say, would be NESI, and world rejecting would be NISE. And you see the same sort of clash between the judging functions. So TEFI on one side, what I'd see as more integrity seeking, and TIFE on the other side being more clarity seeking. You put them together, 2 times 2 equals 4.
All right. So we did a similar discussion on the quadras with Victor Galenko on Ben's channel. And he went into kind of a brief definition of quadras and went through them, talked about some values associated with quadras. Of course, it was lengthened because obviously he needed translation. So we had a translator on there, have to go through that process. So I'm hoping that we can provide our audience with a very similar description that's from your standpoint, obviously, and kind of how you understand quadras. Let's, if you don't mind, starting with the alpha quadra and kind of defining what the principle of that is, the functions, and how that relates to that quadra.
Okay, so for alpha quadra, that'll be the quadra that is both world accepting and clarity seeking. So the main aspect of being world accepting is the idea of being able to expand one's possibilities, be open to all the different possible things that could happen. The idea that you don't want to limit yourself, you don't want to cut yourself off from these different possibilities, from different distractions. You want to be open to these areas, open to these different kinds of change. At the same time, the introverted sensation is the idea of going with a sort of physical flow in the moment, things being organically, things being quite naturally. I noticed that Dan was actually presenting some of these values, and he's talking about counterphobic sixes and how he didn't like how rigid they were. But there's this sort of idea that introvert sensation goes with flow and savors the aspects in the moment, and extrovert intuition opens up the new possibilities for exploration of our world. And that's, I'd say, how that comes together to form world accepting. Now, then you got this idea of clarity seeking. So clarity seeking, first got introverted logic. And introverted logic is sort of about digitizing information. It's about finding the structure and how it all fits together. It's trying to preserve the internal consistency of that structure. So the idea of you form, say, of a narrative to explain how things fit together, and the idea of making sure that everything within that is meant to fit. Now, at the same time, you have extroverted ethics, more about increasing the emotional mood of people, about expressing one's own emotions authentically. This idea that mood exists as some sort of emotional energy that can be shared and can be used to influence other people's emotional states. And that's what comes together in terms of clarity seeking, in terms of the clarity of one's emotional expression, and also in terms of the clarity of one's understanding. So clarity of emotional expression, say someone clearly showing on their face that they are upset or they are happy, and that emotion gets shared by the group. Whereas introverted logic, more about the idea that it is either correct or it's incorrect. And that when I understand something, I understand it perfectly because all the structures and all the rules all tie together to make it seem perfect in its understanding. That would be clarity seeking. Now, when it comes to alpha, it's important to consider how information elements block together to understand the types of alpha. So you have this rule with blocking, which basically take different IM elements, or you may call them cognitive functions, that say a perceiving function or perceiving information element, say intuition or sensation, that has to block with a judging information element, say logic and ethics. They also have to be opposite in terms of extrovert and introvert. So say NE has to go with either TI or FI, because that's both introverted and that's judging, whereas NE is going to be perceiving. So going by his rules of blocking, you can come to an idea of how the information elements block for the quadra. So when it comes to what's known as the alpha researchers, those who are more intuitive and logical, it's going to be about NE and TI coming together. So NE, TI, what's that about? So that's all about coming to a sort of universalized understanding about how everything fits together in the world, but also about exploring all the different possibilities of the world. It's about having a sort of grand theory where that can be applied to all different contexts to sum everything up. You see this in sort of people like Albert Einstein, you can see it in, say, Stephen Hawking, that sort of idea of constructing this sort of grand theory. And now you find that with the other elements of alpha, say extroverted ethics, that will block with introverted sensation. Again, you have something that's extroverted and judging, something introverted and perceiving. And that takes a certain spin on extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling about emotional expression. When combined with introverted sensation, it's more about feel-good emotions, positive emotions, people feeling happy, environment being comfortable and pleasurable, and say aesthetically pleasing. And that's where you get sort of like Big Bang Theory nerds being coupled with sort of motherly matrons. I say that's sort of probably the best way to understand the alpha quadrant. It's often thought to have, like, say, the inner child as at the center of alpha, that they see things in a sort of naivety where we can create a rule system that can explain everything in our world, and it can apply to all scenarios. The idea we can understand everything perfectly, and you have a sort of idea that our emotions are going to be nice and pleasant. We're going to sort of avoid sort of negative, rather serious or aggressive sort of emotions, and create that sort of childlike atmosphere. Now, do you see? I want to go into the other quadrants as well, yeah?
Well, I would like to see if anybody had any questions on alpha. before we jump to beta or gamma or delta. Daniel, Blake, or Trey? Questions on alpha. That's NTPs and your SFJs, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess if you assume that functions are to be shared and that's how you translate it, then yes.
Right. Yeah, so, I have a question because when I write down my research for my type compatibility videos, I get a lot of backlash between the NTP SFJ coupling, whether it's friends or relationships. Can you shed a little light on this dynamic?
Well, that's what I was saying, that you can't always assume that someone typed in MBTI will be that cognitive function equivalent in socionics. And especially I think that's the case with introverted sensing types. Yeah. At least with, say, ISTPs and ISTJs, you might as well swap them around for transferring them across. SITE in one system is basically TISE in the other, and vice versa if you look at broad brush descriptions. So I wouldn't say that you can promise that an SFJ and NTP is going to get along. What I would say is, in my case, I've got my girlfriend, it would be SCI in socionics. I guess if she were to take an MBTI test, she may come out as SFJ, either ESFJ or ISFJ, depending on what qualifies as extroverted, because it's about socializing. And yes, I'd say that she's a very clear SCI, and we get on very well. And you can see these examples in, say, popular culture. You look at, say, Timon and Pumbaa, the Hakuna Matata philosophy. It means no worries. That's basically that's what alpha's all about. Disney has presented alpha so much in its comic characters, and yeah, and those types go together very well. Timon, very clearly a stereotype of the ENTP, as it were, ILE in socionics, and Pumbaa as the SCI, which I guess you could put as ISFJ, but I wouldn't promise all ISFJs are going to be like that.
So a few points.
In a way, I say that, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, a few points I want to throw out there. A lot of the Daniel had actually made a video regarding SFJs and NTPs being compatible, and he caught a lot of flack for that. And I think it's because what the MBTI community has branded as SFJs being these absolute horrible people. And and so whereas Socionics, the SEI, I think is like the ISFJ. And I think that's it's what I've seen from your descriptions is much different than the way it's been branded in MBTI. And but I want to throw that out there, that if you have the same values, their likelihood of relationship is much more successful. So there's that aspect, and I think that people misunderstood Daniel's intention when he put that video out there. I mean, a lot of people agreed with it and liked it, of course. I mean, but there was a lot of flack he caught for it too, saying that SFJs was a compatible match for NTP. And he threw that out there, and a lot of people were like, oh, no way, too superficial and all this stuff. And that was the branding that happened for the SFJs.
Because, go ahead, Daniel. Not to go off topic, but yeah, in those videos, I merely just go, with the philosophy that I believe that every person has maybe core desires that they're looking for in a mate. It may not necessarily be value driven. So that's why I put the variety there.
And so that's one thing. And then the other thing I want to throw out is you made a comment about in MBTI being extroversion, introversion. The way I was trained was a little more than just sociability of that aspect, but I'm interested in hearing about energizing and integration. And I want our audience to know the last letter on your Socionics code, SEI, LIE, is either integration or it's Energizer. And so Jack, if you could briefly define those so they understand what that last letter means.
The first I should say, but it hasn't always been called Energizer Integrator. That's a term which I came up with. Initially, it was called Intro-Tim or Extra-Tim, meaning extroverted type of information metabolism, some very sort of clunky technical language you find Eastern European someone's coming up with when they're trying to use theory. And with, I found that people very quickly tied to extrovert and introvert. But I thought, well, you're going to be carrying across the same sort of baggage that we had from extrovert, introvert. That extroverts are very sociable, introverts very socially withdrawn. That sort of assumption that people make, which causes a lot of people to identify as ambiverts. Now, with socionics, it's not really about that. It's about, say, being having all the what's known as the extroverted information elements in the bold function, and all the introverted elements in the cautious function if you are an extrovert or an energizer, as I call them, and vice versa for integrators. So what did I mean when I coined the term energizer and integrator? I meant that energizers have more of a breadth perspective. They're people who want to start things up, get things going, inject energy in some form into whether it is the physical activity, the emotional level, how well things are working, improving things, or simply generating new ideas and expanding the possibilities available. Each of the information elements that are called extroverted, they have this sort of breadth perspective, quantity rather than quality, as it were, getting more and more and more. Whereas integrating information elements, there's more about quality and depth. It's about refining, filtering, getting rid of the things that don't quite fit into the framework, making sure all the loose ends are sort of tied up. And so an integrating type, they be more bold at these introverted information elements. And they'd be far more likely to carefully think things over, more likely to tie up the loose ends, or to figure out whether they're comfortable with this, how they feel about this, does it make sense? That sort of thing I'd say is integrating. I guess like a good analogy maybe, say you're working in the field and you take like a big, one person runs in with their spade and they basically shovel up all the straw and then put it into a big pile all at once, and all little bits of straw sort of falling off and collecting down the ground because their job is rather effective, but it's also rather messy. And then you have the integrating type coming along and picking out each bit of straw and making sure it fits into that large barrel, pile of straw, as it were. I take that as a sort of example. The very specific approach, the very sort of loose end tying approach, and then the sort of large push, the big leap.
Right.
See, that's sort of, and it's not really meant to. It's very difficult to think of all energizers or integrators in the same way because there's such variation in how they use different information elements. It's more useful to understand within the Quadra, I'd say.
Yeah, and so that's why we're going to focus on the Quadra. But I wanted that to be thrown out there. That I guess you can closely pair the energizing aspect, or the E, with extroversion, and the integration part with introversion. But it's much more specific in Socionics. The one thing I do want to throw out as well, as far as the energizing aspect and the integration aspect too, is that the sociability is less considered in that regard. It's more about how you're using information, which I find to be much more effective in general, because Socionics relates to information metabolism versus behavior, which was the IE axis in MBTI, which is ironic because in MBTI it's not about behavior ultimately.
Yeah,
exactly. So it created a paradox for me a little bit, because you're telling me not about behavior, but yet you're talking about introversion, extroversion. This is where I had a few hangups with MBTI. As far as being educated in that manner was, of course, I still have my appreciation for it in other regards. That was just one of the few things that I was like, okay, well, why is it this way? If it's not about behavior yet, we're still judging on the amount of introversion versus extroversion, where I think the energizing and the integration aspect makes a lot more sense. And I obviously identify completely with the energizing aspect, where I feel like a lot of the work I do is sloppy, but it's fast, it's action oriented. And then I have to say, okay, I got to go clean that up. And I gotta go clean it up. I'm always finding myself trying to clean up after myself. So I'm like, okay. Yeah, so that being said, I think our audience, I just want to define one term. He says information elements. That's the cognitive functions. Okay, so if you're getting caught up with that word, or those words, then that's your Jungian cognitive function. So when you hear information elements, that's your TE, TI, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to also add what you said about socializing. When we approach socializing Socionics, we think about this is sort of behavior. Suddenly you have to do, what is the information being metabolized in order to socialize? Well, that's sort of connecting with people in the immediate moment, which is why we call our SF types sensory ethical types the socialites, because it is immediate ethical information. So we'd say actually that people who are SFs are more likely to test as extroverted in an MBTI test, even though they may actually be introverted. And people who are more intuitive and logical, where they're least good at processing this sort of information, are more likely to score as introverted in a test, even if they're extroverted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One other thing about you say about cognitive functions, we do use the word functions, but for something very different, which would be the slots in our Model A. So when you may say your dominant function, your auxiliary function, that's sort of how we use function. We use it specifically and only for that slot position, rather than the Jungian cognitive function information element.
So there's 8 slots in Socionics, guys. So if you think of the word function, when you're using the word functions in Socionics, you're referring to the slots. You're not referring to the actual information element. So it's a little bit different there. So make sure you when you're referring to a particular system, that you're appropriately addressing that system. Because in functions, it's MBTI, it's your standard TE, that's what your functions are. In Socionics, your functions are actually your positions in which you insert the information element to understand your type.
Yeah.
So there's that clarity that needs to be made when you're understanding and trying to dissect Socionics in that regard. Blake, Daniel, Trey, any questions for Jack on Alpha Quadra or what we just covered? Blake?
I'm sure my questions will be answered along the way.
I saw you unmute your mic, so I was addressing you. If you unmuted it, I thought you had something to say, so I was waiting for you. But nothing, right?
Yeah, nothing that I can articulate right now.
Okay.
There is, of course, some confusion. I need to learn more.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know what questions to ask. Okay.
Trey, go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily have any like impeccable or amazing questions, but I've got like one just to clarify on what you guys were just now talking about with the 8 slots and calling it functions. So does that mean that like, because when I've seen it online, I've seen the 4 different symbols and the 4 different symbols next to each other, and it kind of makes like a function in math, you know, like the same kind of like deal with the X and Y. It looks like it. So would that be, would one type, that would be their function right there, that block referencing all 8, or would it be like what kind of conversation would you use to reference it? Like when you reference it in Socionics, if I were to talk about the functions, what kind of sentences would it go into, so I can kind of get a picture of how it's all put together?
Actually, for instance, sometimes we do analyses, different personality types of, say, a famous figure, and we'll say, in this example, the person very clearly is using, in my shorthand, I say F1. That basically means extrovert sensation in the first position or leading function. So that's how I'd sort of convey it into a sentence. They are showing signs of F1. They are using F1. That's how I say it. You can just use it as function assignment. So when I reference NI, it can be used completely differently for different types, and so that's why you reference it as N3 or N8.
Uses T for NI.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Use T for NI, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we use the Galenko's. Well, actually, it was actually originally Ausch's abbreviations rather than Galenko's. The idea of was known as tempus or time to refer to introvert intuition, the intuition of time rather than intuition of ideas, which would be more I. So yeah, we use
I what?
Blake.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So I didn't know, Jack, if you created this, but you have, extroverted sensation label. When you're doing those annotations, you use F for extroverted sensation, and then you use S for introverted sensation. Then you use, T for introverted intuition, I for extroverted intuition, P for, your extroverted thinking. We can go through the whole list, but you've annotated it in a way to where this is how you're typing people is going through and locating the position of where that particular function is and on how it's being performed based on where it's fitting in your slot and your functions versus your, where the information element fits in.
Yeah.
So I is your
all the shapes and right rules.
Yeah. So, so, all right. So any questions on alpha? Blake, are you thoroughly confused yet?
Maybe it'll make more sense when we get to gamma.
Okay. Yeah. So let's go through beta, if you don't mind, Jack.
Yeah, absolutely. So beta is similar to alpha in that it's also clarity seeking, but it's the opposite in that it's world rejecting rather than world accepting. So now, world rejecting values. This is when you have introvert intuition and extrovert sensation. Rather than being about accepting how the world is, rather than being about savoring experiences and exploring all different possibilities in the world, it starts with introvert intuition in terms of actually rejecting possibilities and actually limiting the numbers of distractions that may take you away from the clear, likely outcome that you want to achieve. The idea of introvert intuition is that you can often see things as like a linear path from past through to the future, and that you don't want things to distract you from that path. Extrovert sensation, on the other hand, that's all about the sort of fight instinct, the warrior instinct, to actually confront reality, to push things along that sort of path. That's where they come together. The warrior needs his shaman, as I often said, or a prophet, as it were. The idea that to fight for things properly, you need to know what the path is. And so that's how these two elements come together. It's very ambitious, it's very targeted, it's very restless to achieve, whereas world accepting is far more about sitting back and enjoying it.
Jack,
now,
may I interject something real quick? A good example, I think, of this is the warrior needs his prophet would be Alexander the Great and Aristotle, in the sense, right?
I would. It's interesting. Well, Aristotle would certainly be world rejecting. I think he'd probably be more of an LIE.
Yeah,
what
that's
I
what
think
I mean.
was a very good. What I think was a perfect example is maybe Lenin and Marx.
Okay. Yeah.
And how Lenin was a sort of warrior who brought about the Russian Revolution. Marx was the actual, almost the seer, as it were, who put across this sort of idea that it would go by the sort of progression towards communism.
Okay, so are you referring to the prophet style being more of a beta?
Yes, in a way, I'd say that that sort of mystical element of it, without much factual substantiation, is more likely to be the IEI rather than the ILI. I'd say it's a lot more romanticized than beta. And I'll go into that a bit more once I've just covered the clarity seeking. But yeah, so we've still got the clarity seeking of beta. But it's interesting how they block together differently. Now, instead of NE and TI, it's SC and TI. Instead of FE and SI, it's FE and NI. So first we'll deal with FE and NI. Instead of being about sort of positive, enjoy the moment emotions, it's far more about more profound, more selective emotions. Where it's the idea that we're meant to be looking at something of greater meaning and purpose. It's the idea that now this can be related either to a future long-term outcome. It could even be related to the past. Some sort of relation to trends and where things are going, a sense of destiny, a sense of purpose that may be seen as inspiring, may be seen as an important message, something that takes you above the sort of normal day-to-day humdrum. You see this a lot in sort of political figures. You can see it in musicians and other sort of very sort of famous people who try to actually inspire others. Now you see with TI and SE that instead of being about sort of a sort of grand theory where it's exploring all these different possibilities and trying to explain things across multiple contexts, it's far more like a sledgehammer. It's the idea of imposing a truth onto reality. This is how it is. This is how it all makes sense. This is how the world fits together in a sort of very sort of strong sense. It appears in sense of rules, boundaries, lines. Wherever you cross this, there will be consequences for the action in very clear clarity, where everyone knows what's expected of them in a very sort of concrete sense. And also, there's an idea of betas that they're far more ambitious, that their sense of success and impact in the world, the need to have an impact in the world, is going to be far more to do with say how it appears to others. The idea that it produces either fame or it can produce a sense of position, hierarchical structure, that I'm the boss of the structure, I'm in charge, I've got all these things where people recognize that I'm the one who's the boss. And that sort of element we see a lot more in beta. Is why I say that betas are most often normal celebrities in that regard, or politicians or people in powerful positions. Yes, so there's this idea of sort of the collective coming into it as well. This idea that when people in beta come together, rather than being sort of like this sort of open-ended sort of family environment that everyone's invited in, sort of very sort of welcoming aspect, we see more in alpha. With beta, it's more when you're with us, you are part of our clan. We will look after you in that sense. We're going to look out for people who are in our sort of category or our circle. But those who may be outside our circle, may have betrayed our circle, they're more against us. And it's the idea of sort of clashes of ideologies. The idea that one group can clash against another group because we're us and they are them. You see this in sort of like West Side Story, the Jets and the Sharks, that sort of idea, sort of a beta aspect. You see it in political parties as well. You can see it in, say, the White Russians versus the Red Russians. And this sort of idea that betas almost exist to identify the problems in the world that they see, and then to tear down that structure and start anew with a new structure whereby they are the new rulers. And yeah, you can see it in clashes in city-states, you see it in revolutions. There is an aspect of their desire for change is focused towards the outside. They can end up being the world changers. It's not the correct question that all betas are political. No, that'll be a huge generalization. But you often find that the types that do engage in politics in terms of world-changing revolution can often be beta types.
Okay, so a few things I want to clarify. In MBTI, the SETI axis is closest to TE, as defined by MBTI. And so TE and MBTI is very associated with creating rules, procedures, structures, and enforcing hierarchy. This type of thing is very TE and MBTI. So this is where a lot of mistypes happen between the translation. And so what you've heard, you may go, well, that sounds like TE. Well, that's not what exactly TE or extroverted logic is in socionics. And so when we get to gamma, we'll talk a little more about that aspect. But I'm kind of just summarizing what you said and making sure I clarify some things for the audience as well.
Yes, I'd like to come to maybe the root of that difference in opinion. In that when Jung talked about what is extrovert and introvert, he talked about the self versus the object. People came to mean that meant introverted use is about internalization, one's personal opinions, whereas extroversion is more about the sort of the externalized opinion, how things actually set in real life. So you may find that it came to the idea that because TE was the extroverted one, there must be about rules in the external, the organization of the external, whereas introverted thinking remains sort of internal principles and philosophies. Now, when it comes to socionics, we say no, they're both based on structures. They're both what's known as static use of logic, rather dynamic use of logic, both integrating in terms of it's about consistency of the rules and being applied. But one is blocked with extrovert sensation, so projected onto their physical reality and made to be the new structure or order, whereas extrovert intuition is blocked with introverted logic for alphas. So it's far more about the ideas and the abstract, the theory, rather than the actual creation of order in the real world.
Yeah, so that's a decent clarification of just exploring that aspect. So you guys might say, oh, that sounds like TE, because every MBTI thing that's slanted or at least influenced by MBTI, people who collaborate and work with MBTI, you're going to hear more TE in the sense of establishing rules, orders, and procedures. As a result, you're going to see the ESTJ and MBTI often translate to different things in socionics. And so you'll see that kind of variation. They may not exactly be an ESTJ in socionics based on that principle alone, the TISE versus the TE that you hear in MBTI. So there's a lot of confusion here. The goal is we're going to be doing a little bit of this and kind of clarifying that so you guys can understand the two systems. There's a lot of compatibility, but there's also a lot of disagreement and based on what school of thought you're in. So just keep an open mind as you approach this. If you're MBTI advocate, just keep an open mind as you listen to this, and just know that this is Jack is highly credentialed in the socionics world, and so just keep an open mind when you're hearing these things. And come on, Jack, you're the founder of the World Socionics Society.
But exactly. I guess if you create your own school, then you can assign as many credentials to yourself as you want.
Hey, Donald Trump did, and
Donald Trump University.
Yeah. So point is, Jack, obviously you're educated in socionics, and the key is here is just for the audience to keep an open mind when they're hearing this and not saying that can't be right because that's what TE is. I'm trying to allow it to where you can kind of see from both perspectives from an audience standpoint. So, all right, guys, any questions on the beta quadra? Trey, Daniel, Blake?
That made a lot of sense to me, actually. Like everything that he said about hierarchy and wanting to eventually make some kind of mark and stuff like that, wanting influence, like that all resonates quite a bit because, I'm pretty satisfied with just about anywhere I'm placed in my life. Like I'm okay with, as long as I'm living and I'm doing all right, I'm okay with it. But like what I actually want to achieve is I want to be heard. You know what I mean? And that's really it. Like, I don't really care about, having lots of things. I just want a cultural influence. I want to be able to say something and I want people to hear me. I want my opinions to at least be heard and debated about and stuff like that, because that'll, that encourages change in people's lives that they can see from a different perspective and can adopt that perspective and possibly fix issues that I personally have had that I've thought about and tried to come up with some kind of solution. So, I related to that quite a bit.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, that there's no necessity for beta to be materialistic. Some are, like Donald Trump is an example, someone who's incredibly materialistic, but then others who are entirely ascetic, usually in terms of how much extrovert sensation or introvert intuition is there. Someone like Gandhi, very ascetic, but still very much about influence in terms of influences of ideas, influences of philosophies and purpose.
Hey, can you give me some figures who were in the beta quadrant? Some famous figures.
Oh, we got a whole load. I think what sort of like more music, like more politics, like more, I don't know, historical. Like we can talk about so many. For EIE, we can have, say, I don't know, David Cameron, Matteo Renzi, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan. You go to, say, Freddie Mercury, David Bowie. You can have Adolf Hitler as like a more negative example. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr. You go to, say, LSI. You got people like Enoch Powell, Malcolm X. Che Guevara, Vladimir Putin, Joseph Stalin, Hillary Clinton, Christopher Langan. You got, say, SLEs. You got people like Donald Trump, Silvio Berlusconi. I say Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Napoleon Bonaparte, Alexander the Great, Rosie O'Donnell, possibly Michelle Obama, Rose McGowan, Miley Cyrus, Madonna. Or say you go to IEI, you've got people like Gandhi, you got Mother Teresa, you got Marilyn Monroe, you got Princess Diana, you got Jake Gyllenhaal, you got Elijah Wood, you got there are so many betas I can list off because they most often end up in that sort of status of celebrity. So you've got a lot more of them than we do of deltas in our celebrity benchmark.
So yeah, as you can see, a lot of betas are prone to politics, and there's a lot of that. And as you can see, they make themselves pretty known in one way or another because they're attempting to influence change.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, as I was saying, not all of them are going to be pretty much about world change, and it could be far more about their own personal life, their personal energy, their own life path to take, and being attracted to the energy and dominance of other people. It doesn't necessarily enact on the political sphere. But yes, usually people who are political, who are using it in that sort of revolutionary way, do tend to be betas.
Okay. So Daniel or Trey, any other comments or questions on beta quadrant?
I'm a beta, right?
Yeah, well, again, we're identifying that. That's the point of today's discussion, is to help identify what your sociotype is. So, okay. Yeah. So you can see Jack's face. So he's having a clash with you as identifying with beta. So, all right, let's move forward. Gamma quadrant. All right, so let's introduce Gamma, Jack.
Okay, so Gamma Quadra, you see a sudden change. Now it's no longer about clarity seeking, it's a lot more about integrity seeking. I said before that, say, Alpha was more like the child quadra, Beta was like the youth quadra, the more rebellious youth, as it were. Now when it comes to Gamma, it's a quadra of sort of ambitious maturity. This is when you still have world rejecting. It's still about not really exploring or immediate options and savoring life as it is. It's far more about success once again. But this time it's about introverted ethics and extroverted logic. Extroverted logic is different to introverted logic in that it's far more about the collection of data, about the improvement and the reassessment of one's knowledge based on factual evidence that's observed. If you can see introverted logic as being the logic of rationalism, the idea that knowledge can be sought a priori, that you just think things out based on deductions, on axioms, mathematically, and you reach truth on that point. Extroverted logic can be far more about empiricism. It's about what you're actually observing to work in reality. And things as they work, it's often more messy than any sort of structural theory. It's the idea that when you do an experiment, show one result, a new experiment show another result, and you're continuously updating your knowledge based on what you're observing. And it's the idea that the more you know in terms of facts, the more you can apply your knowledge practically and effectively. Now, with introverted ethics, rather than being about the expression and communication of moods and emotions and energy, it's going to be far more about relationships. This is one which I'm not very well with myself, because it's my vulnerable function, but I can do an okay job based on what other people with introverted ethics have told me. And it's sort of the idea of psychological distance. The relationship between you and another person is maintained as a stable psychological distance, say one of like, one of dislike, maybe something in between, something you can work with more pragmatically. And the idea that these relationships are kept stable and they're not meant to change. Whereas some of extroverted ethics, where their emotions, how they treat someone else, depend on their mood and on that time of day. With introverted ethics, it's going to be far more stable. It's not going to be something that changes just based on your mood. And that's why people with extroverted logic and introverted ethics, their matter-of-fact style, communicating information as accurately in terms of how it represents the facts as possible, in terms of stable relations towards others, in terms of your attitudes, these people are going to be a lot more about what they say, they mean in terms of a fact, more like to literally take something, rather than with extroverted ethics, introverted logic, more about conveying the mood of how they're feeling. So for them, it's about maintaining that integrity towards the factual truth. And that even if that integrity may be more messy, then a sort of more clear, communicable message. And you'll find with extroverted logic types that, yeah, they can often say things that may not actually be particularly popular, may not be something that comes across very clearly, maybe messy, but it tends to be factually true as much as they have tried to make it. Now, right. The blocking, yeah, sorry, yeah, okay. Now there's also the tendency for gamblers in terms of their blocking, is that they have NI and TE. This is the opposite of TI and NE. Whereas TI and E was saying that the rules can be applied to all circumstances, the NITE approach is more that there's no system so perfect that it can be applied to all circumstances. It's far more skeptical, far more likely to dismiss ideas and possibilities until it sees the evidence suggests it actually could work. And it's a sort of type that's very sort of detached from sort of the day-to-day aspects, very much independent. It's a need to be able to see things and create your own knowledge for your own application of reason, for your own learning and study, to not be swayed by other people's opinions, by other people's say the popular wisdom of the time. And it often leads to sort of saying more unpopular things that often may turn out to be right in the long run. At the same time, you may find that FI is going to be blocked with SE. So this is where instead of extrovert sensation in terms of, say, hierarchical structure, formal positions of power, it's going to be far more about being dominant in your relationships. These types actually do not want to be controlled by anyone else. Rather than being the boss, it's more about not letting anyone else be the boss of them. So these are types who may go off very independently to do things themselves, to have their own personal achievement in the world, and their approach to other people is going to be very much one of sort of harsh judgment. Can I trust you? Can I work with you in some sort of relationship, with a business, or more close, more formal, informal? And this idea that from looking at very physical signs and outward characteristics, they come to opinion whether they like the person or not and how they can work with them. Very pragmatic, while at the same time maintaining their distance with the other person, never really looking to belong to a group, belong to sort of a party with an us versus them. It's more about me versus these other people and how I can actually find the few people in this world who can actually trust, who actually see as an important part of my life. So very much more personal. In where you can find that the beta types may see the gamma types as possibly the more selfish in terms of how they pursue their personal achievement. But anyway, the gammas will say, well, why do I owe my feelings to anyone else? Why should I? It's about the people who are important to me. And yes, you may find these are often more austere. They can come across as more harsh in their assessments of things because they're not so interested in terms of the communication of the mood. But they're also the types that, at the end of the day, are skeptical towards all the stuff they see as bullcrap, and they want to try and get things done to work properly and to improve and to basically be of best use they can in the long run. Very much both tactical in terms of their political approach to other people, but also strategic in terms of the long-term pragmatism that they try to employ.
Okay, so questions on the Gamma Quadra, everyone. Daniel, Blake, Trey, if you have any questions on Gamma. Gamma is basically your NTJs and your SFPs.
Oh. I thought I was in the Gamma.
So Daniel or Blake or Trey, questions on that? Anything about the Gamma Quadra?
Shoot.
It's kind of an outlook of like the world's messed up, but as long as I have me in a way, because it says you said world rejecting, integrity seeking.
Yes.
So it's almost like it's them versus the world, right?
In a way, you could say that. Like one of the best, probably one of the best examples of sort of a gamma philosopher, as it were, in the modern day is probably Ayn Rand. The idea of objectivism, the idea that at the end of the day you got to rely on yourself, and you can't just expect other people to look after you. You got to do it. You got to handle it, and yeah, that's how you can survive. And yeah, it's the idea that some people are born characteristically better than other people. They just have, as a quality of their character, they can just be born as a better person, and based on their better skills and abilities, they can often succeed better. That sort of thing is not really taken as particularly unusual in the Gamma Quadra. They don't assume that everyone is should be put on the basic playing field, or that the system is the source. It's more about personal character, personal integrity, personal responsibility. So yes, which makes them very harsh about personal judgments towards people. They're perfectly happy to say that person is a charlatan and a scoundrel based on what they've done, and they'll erect their judgment towards them based on that.
So they can almost be pretty I don't know, because when I think of that, I can kind of see someone that's like more likely to jab at somebody, like not for the fun of it, but because it's almost like they have to be on defense in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I see that's more often the case, especially with Gamma NTs. I'll say with Gamma SFs, though, they are very socially aware. They know how to come across in a more charming manner. They know how to actually form relationships with people very quickly and come across as approachable and likable in a sort of first among equals sort of way. They're not going to be the ones who are going to distance themselves from just everyone in that more black and white way that, say, a Gamma NT might. It's less all or nothing for them. But yes, it's definitely is emphasis on pragmatism, this idea of whatever works, often with these Gamma SFs, this idea of harsh judgment. So they may be willing to, say, come across charismatic to someone to begin with, give someone a sort of immediate chance in the moment, but as soon as they realize that person's not quite right, they'll be able to set their level of distance.
Okay, perfect. Daniel, you got anything? I think he just hopped off. Okay, so
I just wanted to. Could you define integrity seeking?
Yes. Okay. So integrity seeking is basically extroverted logic and introverted ethics. So extroverted logic is all about making sure that your understanding in terms of knowledge is reflecting the facts in terms of how they're working, not in terms of a set system or a clear structure. The idea that the structure cannot apply to all circumstances. Therefore, the best thing to do is to look at how things are working and build your knowledge piecemeal from that sort of observation. Often you find extroverted logic types the ones who, when they say something in sort of a long explanation, and then someone will try and summarize it, then go, oh no, actually it's not like that, and they'll give another long explanation because the facts they give and exactly how they've appeared, that's the best way of describing it as far as they're concerned. And if you've simplified it, if you've digitized the analog, the black and white, that's already disrupting the integrity of the factual information they're giving you. And you find with introverted ethics, the integrity appears more in terms of sense of personal relations, adhering to whether you like someone or you dislike them and treating them based on how you like them or dislike them. And that like or dislike being something that's more stable. The relationship is preserved in a stable manner. It doesn't just change based on the mood or how you express yourself. And for them, the idea of expressing yourself in any way that isn't simply what you like or what you don't like, saying, they're more likely to say what they feel, how they feel, rather than express the emotional content of how they're feeling. In that regards, they're a lot more matter of fact, a lot more dry in their communication. This is all the things that I say go towards integrity seeking. It's not about the emotional effect. It's not about the clarity of the message. It's more about whether it is accurate and whether it actually is in line with their personal judgments and assessments.
And I actually had an example that I just thought of when you were explaining that, because when I watch movies, there's always this moment where, like, there's an emotional conflict in the movie, and then the person that has the issue, like, someone confronts them with an issue, and they don't explain it completely. Like, they could be telling them the whole story. They could be telling them everything, exactly why, what they're feeling, or how, or what they do understand about the other person's position or whatever, but they don't do that. They just say one thing, or maybe they don't explain anything. And I've noticed that that's more That's more of a TEFI thing versus an FETI, where the FETI wants to validate their feelings using that introverted thinking framework, while extroverted thinking, introverted feeling doesn't really care and is more like I want to make sure that whatever it is legit. It's exactly how it is, and so whatever it is they're feeling, they'll just say that, and they won't explain why or how or anything like that. They'll just give it solid, plain and dry. Because they feel like it's more true instead of beating around the bush. Yeah, in general, gamma types, but even betas as well, I'm not less inclined to beat around the bush. They'll beat around the bush thing, more of an extrovert intuition thing, I find. Alphas can often beat around the bush, I guess. When it comes to gammas, they're usually quite straight in terms of what they say and what they think. But betas can be that way too, to be fair. They also rather direct, but still more about clarity in the message. So yeah.
Okay. Anything else, Blake? Question?
Oh no, I was just saying, can we move on to the next one?
Yeah, Delta. Okay, so let's dive into Delta.
Okay. So Delta, maintain that integrity seeking, but instead of that more cynical sort of world rejecting aspect, it takes on world accepting once again. Now, in a way, I've been watching quite a few Marvel superhero films recently. Whether I take something like I know Doctor Strange, say, as a good example of someone with more gamma values, I'd say Captain America is the person with the best example of, or idealized example of, Delta values. So let's go down in terms of, we looked at these different dichotomies of world accepting and integrity. Let's look at the blockings. So you find that extroverted logic, instead of being blocked with introverted intuition, is now blocked with introverted sensation. So rather than seeing things in terms of the long-term consequences, how it's going to work in the long run, and sort of reaching independent assessments, instead it's going to be far more rooted in terms of the day-to-day applications of practicality. It's going to be about doing things to a good standard, doing a good job, doing things as well as you can, basically. And if you haven't, you sort of let yourself down as a person. There's an aspect that instead of any independence, it's more about self-sufficiency. You need to be able to do things yourself because you need to live up to your own standards as a person. And in general, the treatment of knowledge is one where it's more important to be able to see it working in real life, sort of more physically handling the physical data yourself, than necessarily reading about sort of something that's detached from your reality, something you can perceive. Now, FI is blocked with NE. So instead of being about harsh judgment, it's about good faith judgment. There's still the assumption that people have a set character, and you're trying to work out what that character is, who they are as a person, but it's far more about giving people a chance. It's far more about thinking, maybe I've misunderstood this person, maybe actually a good person inside, and looking for that better aspect of them that isn't immediately obvious in their character. Far more slow to judge than, say, the harsh judgment of gammas. Far less likely to dismiss someone, more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. It's very much also about exploring people's perspectives. I mentioned with alphas how they can explore any sort of anything as possible aspect, as long as you can explain it, as long as you can make sense of it. For deltas, it's far more about exploring all the possibilities based on people's perspectives, getting to know different people who are interesting, who have some character they find fascinating, understanding their perspective on life. The idea that there could be multiple truths, as it were, based on how you can explore them. The idea of there being psychologists who can get to know different people, or talk show hosts. I imagine someone like Ellen DeGeneres, someone who likes to sit down and talk to different people, find out the different perspectives. Very much sort of extroverted intuition, introverted ethics there, but not really imposing anything on them, not trying to influence, just trying to explore and get to know different sorts of people. And yes, extroverted logic and introverted sensation is also very much, I want to say Captain America, everything he wants to do the best job he can in doing. If it's not, you're not living up to your potential. This type about introverted ethics and extroverted intuition is about your personal potential to be a good person. So how you do that? By learning, by self-improvement, by developing as a person, by constantly thinking that you can do something to make yourself better than you, in terms of your actions than you were before, so that you can live up to your personal potential as a human being, as being a good person. And that's sort of the thing that deltas have. In a way, you could say that, well, while betas, their struggles with the external world, They're more likely to want to make changes to the world to replace the old structure with something new. For Delta, it's far more internal. It's about living up to oneself and one's own standards.
Blake, questions on that? You're Captain America. He's LSE as you typed him, right? Captain America?
Yeah, I'd say he's a good example of an idealized, sort of superhuman LSE.
Right. So Blake, that's LSE is what you identify with as far as I know. So
Really? Okay.
yeah, you're Captain America now.
I always like Captain America, but I don't know. He doesn't have a whatever it takes attitude.
Are you talking about the Marvel movies, the Avenger movies?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not going to go on to that. Sorry.
All right. So Blake, questions on Delta since you wanted to move to this Quadra.
How can I use me knowing Delta to get through my ego development or assist in my own growth?
Well, in terms of ego development, so in other words, developing, say, your cognitive functions, your information elements, that sort of idea?
Yeah, the cognitive functions.
Okay, so depending which type you may be, so assuming LSE, well, LSE's main strength is extroverted logic, they're good introverted sensation. Where they sort of need help in is an introverted ethics. Someone who can sort of see the good within them, who gives them a chance, who can essentially give them that sense of knowing that there is someone in there who is good, someone who can actually reach out to becoming better as a person, that sense of development. Now, LSEs, they're far more about self-sufficiency. They're far more about day-to-day practicality. They're going to be dismissive of, say, long-term mysticism, this idea that something's going to happen in the long run. It's definitely going to happen this way, but there are no real concrete facts to back it up. They may be rather distrustful of that sort of information. But yeah, where they really need help is in terms of that sort of good faith judgment for someone else, and the idea that people can see the potential in others. What they try to develop themselves is extrovert intuition. You can see this in terms of LSE's sort of anal aspect of planning. They'll try and plan for everything and every single opportunity and every single possibility. Why? Because they can't see which one's actually likely to happen in the long run. They have no idea. They don't think they think anything can happen, so you might as well plan for everything. And it's sort of like putting in so much effort to do all these sort of day-to-day things because they want to do as best a job as they can. They can't stand the idea of failing their own standards.
It's funny, yeah, you say that. I was getting my hair cut today, and yeah. As she was cutting my hair, I was thinking, man, how should it be so that I can get the most approval out of the most people? And I was thinking back to past experiences. Oh, people like it when it's down, people don't like it when it's up, and these people blah blah blah, like this and that. I was just doing all these analysis in my head. She tried to make small talk with me, but I'm like, I'm trying to figure out my life over here.
I mean, there's interesting with LSEs. There's out of the deltas, they're probably the ones who are most likely, for the sake of necessity, they can put on a sort of a polite face, a friendly face to other people. I think it's good for them as a person to be making an effort to be polite to others. It's a good thing to do. They're not necessarily going to be thinking too much about their reputation in the way that, say, a beta might or an alpha might, how they're looking towards others, but it's more about the extension of them being a good person. This idea in Judaism of being a mensch, that sort of idea, similar sort of idea of deltas, being a good person, a virtuous person. But you may find with SLIs, they often don't really give a damn what people think about them. They often wear clothing that's comfortable to them, that's easy for them to move around with, that's efficient and conserves energy, doesn't waste physical resources, but they don't actually care how it looks. They don't care about that sort of thing. In fact, in general, I found that deltas are very against the sort of physical appearance or look of aspect or the status it may convey, anything like that. They're very, very sort of peaceful, individualistic, very self-sufficient in that regard.
What about LSEs?
LSEs, I said, they're most likely to understand there is some sort of societal need to come across well to others, to actually to be polite. But what they really look for is someone just accepts them for who they are as a person. And that then removes entirely the need for them to make conversation in some way, to put on a certain front for the sake of how it appears and appears to others. I mean, it's very sort of I don't know. You can imagine all sorts of. If you imagine deltas in the superhero, they're often the superhero's dad saying, "With great power comes great responsibility." That sort of very folksy, homespun wisdom. You may imagine a lot of deltas to come up with, but that's the idea. It's really about the self and their improvement, not really so much about other people.
Okay.
This is where the confusion in socionics can get kind of confusing as far as translation from MBTI.
Yeah, I can't. So, one thing I can't just assume that Blake, from being the ESTJ and MBTI, is going to be a delta in socionics. I can't assume it. In fact, I say that because in fact it's the SITE and TISE that is so might as well be swapped around. If you're an ESTJ in MBTI, you're probably more likely to be an ESTP in socionics, if anything.
More likely what?
If you're going to be an ESTJ in the MBTI, you're probably more likely to be SETI or TISE in socionics. I imagine a lot of LSIs being typed as ESTJs and MBTI, and maybe ESTPs, ESTJ.
Yo. What quadrant is that in that you just said?
Beta. More likely beta.
Yeah. Right.
All right. One step at a time.
Yeah, one step at a time, Blake. We can talk about this later. We can go into your whole dimension at another time. So
dementia.
Maybe I can give some examples of LSEs, like real life LSEs. We've got a few.
Right.
So we've got like Mitt Romney, Mike Rowe, David Petraeus, George H.W. Bush. Not George W. Bush, George H.W. Just that sort of. They're not exactly exciting, dynamic characters. I mean, they're very energetic, they're very restless, very busy. They don't ever come across as particularly exciting. Yeah.
Okay, so now this is the quadra of, well, if you translate it from MBTIs, you're going to get STJs and NFPs if you're a direct translation. So this is that quadra. So do you guys have any questions on the NFP, STJ, in this particular quadrant, delta quadrant? Daniel, if you're there, do you have anything to add or comment on delta quadrant? Trey, same thing?
No, not at the moment.
What was that, Daniel?
I said not at the moment.
Okay. All right, perfect. All right, so we've covered the quadras. The one thing I want to make sure that we clarify a little more here before we wrap up this call and call it a close for a night is just to make sure that to understand a few things. Number one is that the quadra has a set of values, and obviously it's a general set. There are circumstances in which there's going to be obviously your small modifications, but we use it as a tool to help you identify the translation. So let me look at the question in the chat real quick. What other typings are harder to translate straight from MBTI to Socionics? This is Jack, you want to take that one?
Yeah, okay, so I say in general the introverted sensing types are the hardest to translate. At the same time, those with TE are going to be probably hard to translate, especially say TESI types. I think that sometimes you may find that say ENFPs, they can often actually be ENFJs in socionics because there's some too dramatic, too zany. This idea that NE has to be very zany and hyperactive doesn't necessarily make so much sense. It's more of an intuitive thing in your head than necessarily in terms of your actions. There are other examples. I say, basic examples, LSI and SLI might well be switched around ICJ, ISTP. Trying to think of others. Ooh. I find that those which are easier to translate are actually those which are introverted, intuitive. Say INFPs, INFJs, INTJs, INTPs. Usually if you just put the cognitive functions across, in more often than not, I'd say you might to get the right type, but you can't assume at any point in MBTI that your type is going to be the cognitive functional information element equivalent in socionics. And that's how you end up thinking you're one type, then building an understanding of all the other types around your understanding, then realizing after some sort of epistemic lurch, as it were, that it's all not actually making sense. Right. So I would not make that assumption. I don't think it's a safe thing to do in general. I think the best thing to do is learn socionics approached as a new understanding, unpick the knot to tie the new knot.
Right, exactly. So the key is, guys, if you're trying to learn socionics, just to clarify what he said, Jack said here earlier, was to approach it like a new system. Don't try to translate your current type. It's going to get really muddled. And so approach it as if each information element is a totally different universe. and the functions. And if you go that route, you're probably going to be more accurate in your translation of it because they don't smoothly translate. I've had a lot of arguments. I mean, I've had people comment all over the channel about how they do translate perfectly. I am not seeing that. I don't see how it fits. There are some aspects and components that do translate well. But in my experience, I see SI and SE fail to translate effectively. TETI fail to translate effectively. NI, roughly the same, I would say, as far as MBTI goes.
NE translates pretty much the same.
Yeah, NE translate the same, except in MBTI, NE is more about hyperactive behavior.
Anyway, yeah, I think in MBTI, when you got someone like Russell Brand, who's very clear, sort of crazy, slightly bipolar, manic state. People say that's NE, he's NE all over the place. But that's not really, if you look at ENFPs and IEs and ILEs and Socionics, they're not necessarily going to be that way. ILEs more likely because they're actually expressing their emotional states, ready to actually impress people, to actually come across in sort of clownish manner. ENFPs, very unlikely. They use their extroverted ethics purely to serve their introverted feeling, and it's good that they can be very likable, they can be charismatic people, but not going to be over the top expressive. Look at Ellen DeGeneres. She's a very good example of an IE. She's matter of fact in her interviewing style. Sure, she can get emotional on stage, but it's very personal, heartfelt when that happens. It's not like a Russell Brand sort of manic sort of hyper expressive type. He'd actually be what I say is an ENFJ in Socionics, the EIE. And a lot of people who are EIE can be typed as ENFP in MBTI, because I think FI is sort of not really, especially in the auxiliary position, I think it gets twisted slightly. It's not really, and I think it's also because the FE in MBTI is too much about sort of the social norms, too much about kowtowing to social normality. And a lot of ENFJs are very rebellious. They actually want to rewrite what is social normal. They want to rebel against the old. So, I think a lot of the times that some cognitive functions can have more complex meanings in Socionics and be applied more different sorts of context. And sometimes, in the same way I said that TE in MBTI is like TI plus SE in Socionics, FE in MBTI is almost exclusively FE plus SI in Socionics. So the FE plus NI is not really understood, and you get a lot of Socionics ESFJs typing as ENFJs in MBTI for that reason, and then the ENFPs to ENFJs. It's like a sliding effect from one type mistyping to another, and that one mistypes another one, and that one mistypes another one. So it can get very complex if you take down the one-on-one translation route. It's not a good path to take.
All right, so let's address any questions the audience has, and then let's start wrapping it up. Blake puts help. So Blake we'll talk about a little more later. Let's see. Do you guys think, by any means chance, Socionics will mold into MBTI in the sense INFJ, LSI, where it'll be like a different type of INFJ, or it's clearly different? I don't think they're ever going to mold personally. I think that Socionics, that is very popular in the Eastern world, as far as Russia, Ukraine, Europe, type of Eastern Europe, and Russia, that area, more than it is in the United States.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to move or translate to MBTI. Also, we have to remember, MBTI is very stubborn. MBTI as a company, it's a closed system. No one can contribute to it other than people that actually work in that particular organization. So it's much slower. If you look at MBTI, what you'll see is very rudimentary cognitive functions. They're more focused on the dichotomies, E versus I, N versus S, T versus F, and J versus P. So
they've abandoned Jung.
Yes, they've moved away from Jung and moved more into dichotomies and understanding the personal preferences. MBTI does not talk about strength of functions. It's about preferences, which I've stressed so many times on my channel. It's preferences, preferences. There's no model in MBTI to support strength or use of functions. It's just preference. So MBTI is a different tool. So try not to translate preferences over into functional strengths and weaknesses, which is more of the Socionics standpoint and use of functions. So that being said, make sure you do this diligently but carefully, and understand that you may actually have a different Socionics type, as far as I understand. So any last questions, Daniel, Trey, Blake, before we do that? So
nope. I'm all
right,
set.
Perfect. All right, Jack, thank you so much for introducing the Quadras and schooling us on Socionics. We always appreciate
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So and audience, thank you for watching and being part of the community as well. So I appreciate you guys very much. And Blake, Trey, Daniel, anything else to say before we close out?
No, this was an awesome lesson.
Perfect. All right. All right. Well, we'll see you all next time.
All right. Take care.